this video, I'm going to be telling you about every single sword from Blox Fruits in One Piece. And starting off, we got the katana, and this is a pretty basic sword, and there isn't really a specific user for this one. It's just something that the Marines use. And the same goes for the cutlass. That's probably why it has the exact same abilities. Next up, we got the dual katanas, and a lot of you will probably be surprised of the answer for this one. And the owner of these swords are actually Zoro, but not really, because you guys remember at the very start of the show when Zoro had two really bad swords? Well, those are the swords that he actually used for his two sword styles. So I guess that's what the dual katanas are referring to. It's just his terrible swords. The next sword that we got here is the Iron Mace, and the person that actually used this was actually the very first villain of the show, Alvida. She was literally in episode 1 of the show, and she was trying to fight Luffy. And that's when we see the Iron Mace in play. It isn't really a crazy weapon. I'm sure other characters in the show probably have it as well. It's just that the first time we ever saw it on screen, it was used by this character. Moving on, the next sword that I got here is the Shark Saw. And this sword was actually used by Arlong. And if you don't know who Arlong is, he's also one of the first villains of the show. And Luffy fights against him in the Arlong Park arc. And this is what the sword looks like in One Piece. It's literally a perfect replica. The only thing that's changed is his name. And just like the previous swords on this list, this sword doesn't really have any special qualities. It's just kind of a sword that has spikes. The next sword that we got here is the triple katana. And this is obviously referring to the only character in the show that uses 3 swords. It's obviously Zoro. But this one is actually kind of confusing because there's never a point in the show where he has 3 default swords. He always has a powerful sword. And at the start, the special sword that he had was the Wado Ichimoto. But I guess in Blox Fruits, they just kind of wanted to make the weapons default. That's why they changed one of the blades. And the moves of the sword in Blox Fruits are also the same moves that Zoro uses. So that's how we know that it's based off those specific swords. Anyways, moving on, the next swords that we got here are the twin hooks. And these were used by a character who appears way later in the show, literally in episode 746. And it's Jack. Or to be specific, Jack the Drought, one of Kaido's henchmen. This guy uses the twin hook swords, but I'm not really sure if they're called that in the anime. They don't really have a name, and there isn't really anything special about them, except for the way that they look. They're pretty cool. And this has a very good Blox Fruits replication because the swords look almost identical in Blox Fruits. And in-game, they're even owned by the Captain Elephant boss, who's based off Jack. So I think overall, Blox Fruits did a pretty good job with this one. Moving on, the next sword that I got here is the Dragon Trident, and this unfortunately does not have any replications in Blox Fruits. I might be wrong, but I couldn't find any. After that, we got the dual-headed blade, and this is owned by a character called Hannibal, who is actually the vice warden at Impel Down. He didn't have that much screen time compared to the other characters, so I wouldn't be surprised if you guys forgot about him. Well, basically, he holds 2 different swords. One of them is like a black trident, and the other one is this dual-headed blade. And I'm not really sure what it's called in the anime, because the sword doesn't really have a name, so it's just kind of irrelevant. It's just his own thing, I guess. Moving on, the next sword that we got here is the Gravity Cane. And the boss that uses it in Blox Fruit is Fujitora. You already know this is based off Fujitora's weapon. And if you don't know, by the way, Fujitora is a character that uses the Gravity Fruit, so he actually combines his gravity powers with his sword to just basically destroy his enemies. Well, let's talk about this sword in specific because this is the first special sword on this list. The sword's name is Yakuza Kaizen, and this is one of the 12 supreme grade swords in One Piece. If you don't know what those mean, they're basically just swords that are extremely powerful, and they were forged by a powerful sword maker. And there are more supreme blades on this list, so make sure you keep watching if you want to find out all of them. And the first time we see this sword is in episode 630. And we've also seen Fujitora use this weapon before when he literally destroyed Zoro. Moving on, the next sword that we got here is the Jite sword, and this is based off a sword in One Piece called the Nanashaku Jite. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, I'm probably not. This sword also has something incredibly special about it. In One Piece, the tip of the sword is made out of sea stone, which means when you touch a Devil Fruit user with it, it actually stops them from using their Devil Fruit powers. But I think I know why they didn't add this to Blox Fruits, because it would just be way too overpowered for a sword to be able to literally steal away Devil Fruit abilities. And the first time we ever see this sword in the show is in episode 48. And later in the show, Smoker even uses this sword to completely destroy Luffy, and I'm pretty sure this was the first villain that Luffy actually had trouble fighting. Moving on, the next sword that we got here is the long sword. It was used by a character called Kairos all the way in the Dressrosa arc in episode 631. And like I mentioned, there's nothing special about it. It's just the sword he uses, and I'm not even sure if it's the same sword. It just happens to look alike. Moving on, the next weapon that I got here is the pipe. And you might be thinking, who the heck in One Piece uses a pipe? Well, it's one of the fan favorite characters, Sabo. He doesn't really use it that much, but it is kind of his iconic weapon. And it's actually a weapon that he's been using ever since he was a kid. And obviously this weapon isn't really like a supreme blade or anything like that, because it's literally just a pipe that he picked up, and he uses his hockey and powers on it to just make it a lot better. I mean, just look at how cool it looks. This guy's like the only character in the show that can make a pipe look badass. Moving on, the next sword that we got here is the Soul Cane, and I'm pretty sure all of you should know who uses this. It's Brook, our favorite dead character from the show. And they've honestly replicated this really well in Blox Fruits because it looks exactly the same, and even some of its abilities are used. In One Piece, this sword is called Soul Solid, and we don't know much about this sword, but this sword does have ice-based powers, and that's replicated really well in Blox Fruits. And probably one of my favorite swords in the whole game. It's just honestly really cool. Moving on, the next sword that I got here is the Trident, and this was used by one of the villains named Holiday Jones. who first showed up in episode 527. And this weapon isn't really crazy, it's just a pretty basic trident, and we've seen many other tridents in the show, and this just happens to be another one of those. And as far as tridents go, this might be on the weaker side because we didn't really see any special powers out of this weapon. Moving on, the next sword that we got here is the Warden sword, which also unfortunately not shown in One Piece. Or it might be, I just couldn't find it. The next sword that we got here is the Bisento, and this is used by the strongest man in the world, Whitebeard. And you already know this sword is powerful because just look at how powerful its wielder is. The name of the sword in One Piece is Murakomogiri. I definitely butchered that pronunciation, but this is one of the 12 supreme grade blades, so you already know it's one of the best swords in the whole verse. And the meaning of the sword is actually gathering clouds clutter. And the cool thing about this sword is that Whitebeard actually uses his powers with the sword, so he kind of transfers them into it. And that's why when you use this sword in One Piece, it actually has some of the powers of the Quake Fruit. It's honestly a really cool addition. Moving on, the next sword that we got here is the Buddy sword, and in the show this is used by Charlotte Linland, aka Big Mom. And this isn't really a sword, she literally just uses her powers on her hat and she just turns it into a sword. And in One Piece the sword's name is Napoleon, and the only special thing about this sword is that it's literally alive. When was the last time you saw a sword with eyes and a mouth? Really weird. But they have replicated this extremely well in Blox Fruits. I mean, the Big Mom boss in game literally uses the sword. Moving on, the next sword that I got here is Cavendish, and this is used by Cavendish, and I'm pretty sure they literally named the sword after this guy. The name of the actual sword is Durandal, which sounds literally nothing like Cavendish. And not much is known about this sword, but it is a pretty decent sword because we have seen this character use it to destroy some people. Moving on, the next sword that I got here is a pretty funny one. This is the Dark Dagger, and it was literally used by the strongest swordsman in the world, Dracula Mihawk. And he just used it to decimate Zoro in a fight. And the way it looks in One Piece is extremely similar to how it looks in Blox Fruits. I mean, literally just look at them side by side. And if you didn't know, this sword actually does have a name. It's called the Kogatana. And obviously isn't a supreme blade because, I mean, just look at it. It's kind of pathetic. The only reason he destroyed Zoro with it is because he's literally the strongest swordsman in the world. And there is another sword that he uses from Blox Fruits, but we'll get to that later. Moving on, the next sword that I got here is the Coco sword. And in One Piece, this sword is used by Law. Or should I say Trafalgar D. Walter Law. And the name of the sword in One Piece is Kikyo. This is actually a cursed sword. And the direct translation of the sword literally says Ogre Whale. And it works perfectly because the Law boss in-game also uses the same sword. Moving on, the next sword that we got here is the Pole V1. And this is obviously used by Enel in Blox Fruits as well as One Piece. But it isn't really a main part of his power. He kind of just channels his electricity in the pole to shoot out attacks. And the name of this pole is called Nonosama Bo. There isn't really anything special about it, but it honestly could be a supreme blade because we've only seen it used in Skypiea so far. But I really doubt it. Moving on, the next sword that I got here is the Rengoku sword. And this is actually the only sword on this list that actually isn't from One Piece. This is from Demon Slayer. And the character it's from is literally Rengoku. The name of the sword is the name of the character that uses it. There isn't anything special for the sword except that this character uses it. And I think the devs just added it to the game to just pay tribute to this guy because he's one of the coolest characters in anime. Moving on, the next sword that I got here is the Saber sword. And in One Piece, this is obviously used by Shanks. And the actual name of the sword in One Piece is Gryphon. And the pretty cool thing about the sword is that this was the sword that Gold Roger actually used before he ended up dying. And he actually just passed it on to Shanks. I mean, just look at how big it looks compared to Shanks. And Shanks is literally 200 centimeters tall. That's just crazy. Moving on, the next sword that I got here is the Sadi sword. And in One Piece, this one is called the Sandai Kitetsu. And this sword in One Piece is actually a cursed sword, which means it's incredibly powerful if you can handle the curse that's on it. After that, we got another one of Zoro's swords, and this is the Wado sword. And in One Piece, this is called the Wado Ichimonji. And this was actually gifted to him by one of his childhood friends, who sadly ended up dying. And this sword is actually one of the 21 great swords, which makes it incredibly powerful. The next sword that I got here is the Yama sword, and this was wielded by Kozuki Oden, one of the strongest characters in the whole show. And in One Piece, this sword is called Enma. And Oden doesn't actually wield the sword anymore. It's obviously been given to Zoro, but this guy was the original owner of the sword. And yes, Enma is one of the 21 great blades, which makes it an incredibly powerful sword. The next sword that we got here is the Shisui sword. And in One Piece, this is called the Shisui sword. It literally has the exact same name, and it was wielded by Ryuma. And when we see him use it in the show, he's actually a zombie, so he's extremely underpowered. He actually ends up giving the sword to Zoro, and Zoro does end up using that sword for a while, but he eventually ends up giving the sword back to Wano and getting Enma in return. Moving on, the next sword that we got here is the Spiky Trident. And in Blox Fruits, this is actually used by the Doking. So you already know in One Piece it's used by Katakuri. There isn't really anything special about this sword, but we do know its name. It's called Magura. And other than that, we don't really know much, but it is a pretty powerful sword. Or it's only powerful because the wielder is really powerful. I guess we'll never know. Moving on, the next sword that I got here is the Tushida sword, which is actually the second sword that was owned by Oden, along with Enma. And this sword is called the Ameno Habakiri. And this is one of the 21 great swords, so you already know it's incredibly powerful. It's literally on the same level as Enma. The next sword that I got here is the Cursed Dual Katana, and this is actually based on the swords that Kozuki Oden has. So this is made up of Enma and Ame no Habakiri, the two swords that I just talked about. I know in Bloxwoods you have to do a whole quest just to merge these swords, but in One Piece you just literally have to pick up both of them. Moving on, the next sword that I got here is the True Triple Katana, and this is based on the swords that Zoro uses. But the True Triple Katana is a combination of the Sandai Kitetsu, the Wado Ichimonji, and the Shisui sword. Yes, Zoro did wield all three of these swords at the same time for a short period of time before he switched the Shisui sword for Enma. Moving on, the next sword that I got here is the Dark Blade, and you already know who wields this sword. It's obviously Mihawk, the world's strongest swordsman. And most of you watching should already know what it's called in One Piece. This sword is called Yoru, which literally means night. And it is one of the 12 supreme grade swords. And we first see the sword in episode 23. And he ends up decimating Zoro with this sword. And I think Bloxwoods did a really good job replicating the sword. The first version of the sword in Bloxwoods actually looks a lot more similar to the One Piece version than the current version of the sword. I mean, just look at the difference. But that's pretty much it.